Hello again, everybody, and welcome back to Women for All Seasons, a look at 6 remarkable women who at one point or another called Chicago their hometown. This is part 4, and we're going to have a little look at Sister Rosetta Tharpe. All of these images are used within the fair use guidelines of the American copyright law. My name is Clarence Goodman, and here we go with Sister Rosetta Tharpe, Sacred versus the Secular. Now, Sister Rosetta Tharpe was born in 1915 in a tiny little community of Cotton Plant, Arkansas. And as I'm sure you can imagine, for an itinerant or a migratory or a sharecropping type of farmer back 100 years ago, it would have been a hard scrabble life, to say the least. In the case of Sister Rosetta Tharpe and her family, that was amplified by the fact that we were smack dab in the middle of the Jim Crow era, making things even more difficult and even more trying and more challenging, to say the least. However, there was always church, and Sister Rosetta Tharpe's family were church goers and preaching folk. Both of her parents, her father and her mother, were self-styled preachers, and from a very early age, Sister Rosetta Tharpe showed herself to be a prodigy. And not just a prodigy with regard to music, as we most oftentimes use the word prodigy, and she was a musical prodigy, but she was also a prodigy with regard to her inner light and with regard to her charisma. And so this was some kind of ball of fire that was ready to explode there in Cotton Plant, Arkansas. So what do you do with a ball of fire that's on the verge of exploding? You move to Chicago. And indeed, Sister Rosetta Tharpe's mother took the little girl to Chicago's Bronzeville area, where they set up shop, and the legend started to grow. The church that they attended was the Church of God in Christ. The building is still there. It's now known as the 40th Robert S. Temple Church of God in Christ. Most of the neighborhood there, they refer to it as the 40th, as it's there right near the junction of 40th Street and State Street in Chicago's Bronzeville. This also happened to be the church that was attended by Mamie and Emmett Till. More about them later on down the line. So Sister Rosetta Tharpe got busy with her guitar straight away. And in spite of the fact that she didn't get a whole lot of formal training, she absolutely exploded. That explosion that I was talking about that was going to happen back in Cotton Plant, Arkansas, it started to happen in Chicago. Sadly, there are no pictures, to my knowledge, of her back in her earliest Chicago days. That's back when she would have been a little kid, but we do have some pictures of her from her teenage years and her years in her early 20s. And look at those dimples, look at that smile, look at that form, and my goodness gracious, she got going in a hurry. She even got a record contract fairly early on, and she was honing her immense talent into skills. She was able to record for the Decca Company. Hey, that picture looks familiar. The people of the Decca Record Company, and they did have offices and recording studios in Chicago, they had the good sense to sign her, and she started to record sacred side straight away, but also she started to play popular favorites, and she started to get into writing more pop-oriented, more secular-oriented songs that were based on the gospel songs, this new genre called gospel, that she was playing all over the place. This was going to lead to problems, but she didn't know it at the time. And that she also didn't know at the time was that she had the impending emergence of a woman that would prove to be a fairly bitter rival, or at least in the eyes of this woman. This woman indeed was Mahalia Jackson. There in the late 1920s, crafting a new genre of music with her best professional pal in the world, the man seated at the piano there, the Reverend Thomas A. Dorsey, crafting this new genre of music called gospel. And almost from the very beginning, young Mahalia Jackson remained, and in many people's mind, still remains the definitive voice with regard to gospel in general, but Chicago-based and Chicago-originated gospel specifically. Here's the problem. All of this was going on, and though, to paraphrase the mobsters of and not far from there, the mobsters of Chicago's Levee District of the 1920s, when they talked about going to war, hey, there's plenty of girls, there's plenty of liquor, there's plenty of money for everybody. Shut up, don't worry about it. There were plenty of souls, plenty of ears, plenty of listeners, and plenty of churches, and plenty of people who were just dying to hear gospel music in Bronzeville and Chicago at the time and the immediate region. Apparently, this was not good enough because all reports indicate that the Reverend Thomas A. Dorsey and Mahalia Jackson started to kind of wage a war of words against Sister Rosetta Tharpe. They were basically disparaging her because she was not staying in her lane. She was not sticking specifically with gospel music. And I don't know, there's nothing on record that says that Sister Rosetta Tharpe said anything beyond just off-the-cuff comments to her friends. Nothing on record except for keeping to herself, keeping her head down, and keeping her chin up. And so, what did she do? In the face of meeting this sacred versus secular war, she packed up and moved east. As if Chicago's area, the stroll area in Chicago wasn't big enough, she decided, you know what, I'm going to move to an even bigger pond. So she moves east to Manhattan, specifically to Harlem. And she arrives in Harlem, and what does she do? She fits right in. And actually, it was probably somewhat encouraging to her. As great as Chicago was with a number of musicians from all genres that resided and toiled here, there's nothing quite like Manhattan with regard to American music. Every possible kind of American music you've always been able to find on the island of Manhattan. So she gets to New York, she records more, she plays on the radio more, she writes more, and she just keeps on shredding, and she captures the minds and the imaginations of so many people that were not only people who were earmarked to be her specific and definitive audience, but also her peers, other musicians, all of these men musicians from all kinds of different genres and so forth. They sat down with her and they played, and upon first listening, they would say, wow, she's a good little guitarist. Oh my goodness, she's good for a girl. The types of things that women musicians probably until the end of time will have to hear, nonsense that they'll have to hear for at some point of their career. I know I said things like that when I was a young musician. Well, she fell right in, and as you can see from this picture, taken up at the Cotton Club, I do believe, she's in an informal jam session. That's a Duke Ellington in the middle there. I think that's a very young Cab Calloway sitting over the Duke's left shoulder, and of course the woman in the picture is Sister Rosetta Tharpe, and she looks like she is more than capable of just hanging with the boys, and that is quite a telling smile that the Duke has on his face there, as if he's saying, let me play this lick for you, and she's like, bring it on, man. She participated in these guitar pulls and these guitar wars that happened up at the Apollo and at the Cotton Club. And let's just say she always came out completely unscathed. But as her popularity in New York and thus the tour circuit that she's on is growing and growing, she feels an even greater pull between the sacred and the secular. And so not only does she have that problem, oops, missed a spot there, she's starting to feel the the conflict as generated by being manipulated by men. A series of husbands, a series of managers, a series of men being in the position of prominence that left her not feeling in control of her career. And then there was one other issue in place here. It was at this point that Sister Rosetta Tharpe started to feel, let's just say, ambiguous about her own sexual orientation. And though I imagine that no one was in the bedroom except the participants, there's no definitive word that she was with so-and-so and so forth. Let the record show that she never married again, and she was always only seen in the company of women, most notably her protege, Marie Knight. And there was all kinds of scuttlebutt and gossip up and down the island of Manhattan as far as what their relationship actually was. Who cares? She was making good music and she was a good human being. But these three issues, the sacred versus the secular, trying to get from under the heavy thumbs of men and trying to figure out what's going on with your own body and your own person and your own identity, makes her pull up stakes and head south to Richmond. Now, the last thing you generally hear about a musician, a famous musician or an aspiring musician doing is pulling up stakes and going from a music capital, a Nashville, a New York, a Chicago, to what was indeed a small town. In spite of the fact that Richmond had been the capital of the Confederacy, it was still a really small town by standards of the day. I believe their population was maybe about 150,000 back in those days of the 1940s, whereas the population of the population of Chicago was 3.5 million, and the population of New York City was twice that of Chicago. Nevertheless, she did head to Old Dixie, the capital of Richmond, Virginia. Maybe it was because she wanted to get out of the limelight as she entered into this new phase of her personal life. Maybe she didn't want so many eyes upon her. But this was where her base was for a number of years until she made her final move, which was back up north to Philadelphia. So she went from Cotton Plant, Arkansas, to Chicago, to Harlem, to Richmond and Philadelphia in all of her, almost 60 years of being alive. And so there she still gigged. She still did her work, but she got even further and further and further into the secular, away from the sacred. Why? Because her secular records were making money. They were selling. And the sacred records were not. She was more of a novelty with regard to her secular persona versus her sacred, her gospel persona. And so by this point, unwittingly, late in her career, she was becoming a big noise outside of the sacred. Why? Because this battle, this inner battle that she was feeling when it came to the sacred versus the secular, not only set the template for one of her discoveries, Little Richard, and another person a few years later by the name of Sam Cooke, but it did so well before these two guys were involved with this struggle. And as Malcolm X once said in one of his speeches, anytime you see someone in history who had a problem similar to yours, look to see what they did. And if they got theirs straight, you can get yours straight. So while all of this inner turmoil is going on, unbeknownst to her, the Chicago sound that she has helped in so many ways to create has blasted off from Chicago and transcended the region, transcended the nation, and wound up on the shoulders and on the ears of the boys and girls who would make up the first generation of British rock and roll stars. And they revered the practitioners of the Chicago sound, and specifically Every dude in Great Britain who was going to be a guitar god and a guitar hero absolutely worshipped, pardon the expression, and adored Sister Rosetta Tharpe. And so, shortly before the end of her career and she left this earth, we can say this about Sister Rosetta Tharpe. She pioneered and revolutionized the guitar. If you don't believe me, go look up some of her films, some clips of her on YouTube, and you will fall down. If you've never seen her play and listened to her play and seen her on stage, she was Jimi Hendrix, she was Jimmy Page, she was Eric Clapton before any of those cats really had left private school, as they say, in Britain. She blurred the lines between sacred music and secular, and she did that with one big old chamois cloth. She inspired the entire first generation of American and British guitar heroes and enhanced the British blues boom that would occur in the middle and latter part of the 1960s. She helped to bring black music from the margins of popular music. And on a personal note, number 5, I've never covered a gospel song in my career as a musician going back to the latter part of the 1970s. The first time I ever covered a sacred song, it was her reading of This Train, and it was an honor to do so. And it has been an honor to take you on this little segment of the Lost Highway that has been temporarily, or at least in part, named in honor of the great Sister Rosetta Tharpe. I hope you have enjoyed the journey, and I hope to see you again for part 5, the story of Mother Dolores Hart. Please keep thinking about women for all seasons. Please take care of yourself and one another. And please allow your God to go with you as always. Until then, until we see you again, take very good care. I didn't say Sister Rosetta Stone. And so long, everybody.